Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Abyssos the 8th Circle Savage, Part 2. This video will cover the second encounter, from checkpoint to glorious end. If you're looking for Part 1, check the link in the description below. My name is Miss Tech and I'll be your raid guide. The boss's auto attacks must be shared by both tanks throughout the encounter. These auto attacks will do splash damage in a wide circle around the primary target, so all other players must keep away from the tanks in between major mechanics. Both tanks will also want to ensure their top two enemy targets throughout the encounter. The encounter begins with 3 auto attacks on the primary target. The boss will then cast Niopure, dealing massive raid-wide damage that also applies a 9-second bleed on all players. Mitigate, shield, and heal as necessary. Healers keep an eye on health pools while the bleed runs its duration. 2 more auto attacks are followed by Tyrant's Unholy Darkness, which will target both tanks for high damage tank busters in large circles around them. The 2 tanks will need to spread for this attack while also popping appropriate cooldowns. Immediately after, they'll need to stack back together for another 2 auto attacks. At this point, the boss will cast Natural Alignment. 2 random players of the same role group will be afflicted by Natural Alignment debuffs that last 48 seconds. These debuffs will deal damage over time to the affected players, and healers will need to keep an eye on them to ensure that they don't die, or they will explode and you will wipe. Furthermore, these players cannot take any additional damage from any external sources, or they will explode and you will wipe. As such, it is the job of these 2 players to avoid all damage, no matter what, for the duration of their debuffs. To keep them away from mechanics and easily identify them, we have these 2 players run directly north as soon as they get marked. The boss will then cast Twist Nature, and one of the 2 Natural Alignment players will have a double cast bar marker appear over their head. This marker will show the icons for a stack mechanic and a spread mechanic, each with cast bars next to them. These 2 mechanics will begin to cast, with one cast bar resolving considerably faster than the other. Players will have to identify which cast will go off first and prepare accordingly. At the same time, the boss will cast Tyrant's Flare, which will place a large AoE circle marker underneath all players. Players will stack together to bait these circles in a manageable area. The 2 Natural Alignment players in the north can also stack together and move out of their dropped AoE circle markers as necessary. If the spread mechanic is casting first, all players will move out of the baited AoE circles towards assigned locations on the east and west sections of the platform to avoid overlap. If the stack mechanic is casting first, all players will move together out of the baited AoE circles and stick together to share the incoming damage. We do this by dodging together north and stacking just outside of the AoE circle drops. Immediately after, the boss will begin to cast Ashing Blaze, and one side of him will be on fire, indicating that side of the platform will soon be blasted. All players will need to move to safety on the opposite side. The second casted mechanic will be resolving at the same time here, and players will need to immediately stack or spread on the safe side to avoid death. The 2 players in the north will also need to dodge to the appropriate side as well, staying near the wall to avoid getting hit by any extra mechanics. Next up, the second Natural Alignment player will form a cast bar marker above their head. This time, there will be an icon and cast bar for fire and one for ice. At the same time, boss clones will appear on the west side of the platform, each targeting the row directly in front of them for a line attack. These clones will always spawn in such a way that either the first or the second row of the platform will be safe. All players will need to immediately move into the row unaffected by boss clones to handle the next set of mechanics. The Natural Alignment player will begin to cast either fire or ice first. Fire will target the 3 furthest players from the Natural Alignment player for damage that must be shared by 2 players. Ice will instead target the 2 closest players for damage that must be shared by 3 players each. If any of these attacks overlap, or you're missing the requisite number of players to share the damage of each attack, you will die. This first fire or ice Natural Alignment cast will coincide with the first set of clone blasts. Immediately after, another round of clones will appear on the east side, and whichever of the top 2 rows that wasn't safe originally will be safe this time. The second fire or ice Natural Alignment cast will go off at the same time that the second set of clones blast the platform. To handle any variation of this mechanic, we have the players of the same role group as the Natural Alignment players act as baiters and adjusters based on the type of attack that is incoming and which row of the platform is safe. All players can use the line markers on the platform within the 2 center tiles to help maintain consistency in positioning. The first step is to identify which of the 2 rows will be safe from the first set of clone blasts. The 2 Natural Alignment players will stand together in the center of the 2 tiles in the safe row, as close to the center row line as possible. The rest of the group will split into East and West. To keep it intuitive, we based the split on our original spread assignments, with 2 players in each role group assigned to swap positions if necessary, based on who gets afflicted with natural alignment. If ice is being cast first, all non-baiting players will stand close to the outer line of the tiles on either side, while the baiting players stand in the center of the tile triangle markers on each side. If fire is being cast first, then the 2 baiters will move to the north or south, opposite the 2 natural alignment players in the safe row. One player will stand on the far edge, with the other player a few steps closer to the center. You can use the triangle markers for reference here as well. The other 2 player pairs on the east and west will have one player move into the center of the triangle marker on their side. To further avoid confusion, you can also assign which player of each pair will stand where, based on each possible permutation of debuffs and players. However, don't be disheartened if it still takes some time and practice before the movement becomes second nature for everyone. As soon as the first round of attacks go off, all players will move into the second safe row and again position based on the incoming ice or fire cast. Once the second round of attacks go off, the natural alignment players will lose their debuffs and the boss will cast another Ionopeer, mitigate, shield, and heal as necessary. Watch out for that bleed. Move away from the tanks during this time to avoid getting clipped by the next round of auto attacks. There will be 2 more auto attacks before the boss casts Tyrant's Unholy Darkness again. The tanks will separate and take their respective tank busters with cooldowns before stacking back up for 1 more auto attack. Alternatively, with some clever timed use of immunities, tanks can also take auto attacks by themselves. The boss will then begin to cast High Concept. This cast will deal massive raid-wide damage and you'll need to plan your raid mitigation appropriately. Healers will also need to be ready to top everyone off and add extra shields and regens to the raid after the initial damage goes off, to prepare for the damage of the incoming combo of mechanics. During the High Concept mini phases, the boss will be untargetable. All players will be afflicted by specific debuffs that must be resolved in a specific manner based on what the boss will soon cast. Since you're not worrying about boss damage, your brain cell can instead focus on identifying and resolving your own specific mechanics. Also, to make our positioning as intuitive as possible, we use color-coded waymarkers to our advantage specifically for this phase. As soon as the High Concept cast goes off, all players will be marked by a single debuff with a timer of either 8 seconds or 26 seconds. The players with the shorter 8-second debuffs will obviously resolve first. Of the short debuff timers, one player will be marked with a red Imperfection Alpha debuff, one player will be marked with a yellow Imperfection Beta debuff, and one player will be marked with an orange Imperfection Gamma debuff. At the end of their timers, these 3 players will explode in massive AoE circles that will deal high damage and apply debuffs, and a Perfection Alpha, Beta, or Gamma buff on anyone hit, indicated by this fancy triple element marker above their heads. The element that appears as the bottom icon of this marker will always correlate to the Alpha, Beta, Gamma debuff it originated from. Alpha will form a red fire icon, Beta will form a yellow flask icon, and Gamma will form an orange leaf icon. The additional 2 element icons on each marker will be random, but can consist of purple lightning, green wind, or blue water. We'll talk about how these elements come into play very soon. To avoid overlap, the red Alpha player will immediately run to the corner with the red A waymarker. The yellow Beta player will immediately run to the corner with a yellow B waymarker, while the orange Gamma player will immediately run to the purple 4 waymarker. Obviously, there is no orange waymarker in game, but everyone knows purple is the best color combination for orange, so it makes sense. Go Tigers! Additionally, there will be another 2 players with 8-second debuffs, and they'll be marked with either a yellow multi-splice or blue super splice debuff. If you look closely at the debuff icons, the yellow debuff has 2 players on the icon, while the blue debuff depicts 3 players. This indicates how many people will need to stack with each afflicted player to share their incoming damage. To handle this, the yellow player will stand on the yellow 2 marker with one other player, 2-way marker for 2 players. The blue player will stand on the blue 3-way marker with 2 other players, 3-way marker for 3 players. Furthermore, the 2 splice debuffs cannot be overlapped with each other or any of the alpha, beta, or gamma blasts, so the waymarkers are placed in the safe southeast quadrant of the platform away from each exploding corner. Lastly, the remaining 3 players will all be marked with long 26-second imperfection alpha, beta, or gamma debuffs. Since these timers will not explode for a while, these players will be the ones to stack with the blue and yellow splice players. To avoid confusion, the long alpha and beta players will always stack with the blue debuff player on the 3-way marker, while the long gamma player will always stack with the yellow player on the 2-way marker. Since 8 seconds isn't a very long time, as soon as the high concept debuffs apply, all players will need to immediately move into their assigned positions to resolve the first set of mechanics. Use sprint if you need to. The resolution of this first round of debuffs deals quite a bit of damage on affected players. I recommend moving into the center immediately after to allow healers to top you off. During this time, the boss will also cast Arcane Control, and 2 puddles will appear in the center of the platform. These puddles can either be green wind, purple lightning, or blue water. If you've been paying attention, you'll notice that these elements correlate to some of the elemental icons above the players from the first round of Alpha, Beta, and Gamma explosions. No matter what type of puddles spawn, 2 players will each have an elemental icon that matches the element of the puddles in the center. These 2 players must immediately move into the center and stack together. Doing so will fuse their markers together, forming a new conception buff icon above their heads that will match the element of the puddles. This will allow them to enter and soak the puddles in the center before they explode. All other players must avoid these puddles, as entering into them without the appropriate conception buff will apply a lethal debuff on them. To avoid confusion, each fusing player will communicate verbally or with body language which puddle they plan on soaking once their conception marker appears. Also, since only 2 of the 3 Alpha, Beta, or Gamma players will need to fuse, the leftover player can just hang out by themselves for a bit here. At the same time, the boss will be casting Ashing Blaze, and all players will need to adjust into the safe side of the platform. The players soaking the puddles will also need to stand on the east or west side of their puddle to avoid getting blasted. As players are dodging the Ashing Blaze, the long timers on the remaining Alpha, Beta, and Gamma players are running out, and these players will need to be ready to run into their appropriate corners immediately after the blast to resolve their debuffs. As this is happening, the boss will again cast Arcane Control, this time spawning 4 elemental puddles in the center. In order to soak all of these puddles, there will need to be a total of 4 players fusing together with the appropriate elements. Since there is no way to determine what the puddle element will be in advance, the group will need to prepare for any possibility. This is accomplished by making sure there are 2 players with each perfection Alpha, Beta, and Gamma buffs going into this puddle round. Now that we know what needs to happen, let's rewind a bit to see how to make it happen. We already have one of the original perfection players left over from the first round, and no matter what, that long player of the same letter will be exploding soon. As such, this perfection buff will not be needed to be manually doubled up on. Another way to think about it is the 2 letter debuffs that soak the original 2 puddles will need to be doubled up on. To do this, the 2 original Splice players will each need to stand with the long debuff players to get hit by their attack, creating 2 players with each types of perfection buff markers. During this time, everyone else will move to the southeast quadrant to avoid getting hit. Once the long debuffs go off and the 4 puddles appear, all marked players will look at their elemental icons and see if they have any matching elements to the puddles. If so, they'll move in to fuse with another player with a matching element, and then soak one of the 4 puddles once their conceptual marker appears. Again, to avoid confusion, the original long debuff players will always run to the north 2 puddles, while the original Splice players that picked up the markers, or the original short debuff leftover marker player will always move to the south 2 puddles. Communicate which puddle you plan on soaking, and then move into it once your conception marker appears. The boss will cast another Ashing Blaze, and all players will need to adjust into the safe side of the platform. Players with marker icons that cannot fuse can hang out away from others to avoid accidental fusions. Once the 4 towers are soaked, the boss will become targetable and cast Deconceptualize, removing any remaining marker buffs from players and marking the end of this high concept phase. The boss will then cast Ionopyre again, shield and heal as necessary. The tanks will share another 3 auto attacks before the boss casts Limitless Desolation. To prepare for this mechanic, we split the group by role, with our tanks and healers heading west while our damage dealers head east. This mechanic consists of 4 rounds of targeted AoEs, AoE ground attacks, and soak towers, with each round targeting 1 player from each role group. As soon as the cast begins, we have each player in each role group spread to an assigned position. The boss will then begin to target a player in each role group in sequence with fire AoE circle blasts that will also apply fire resist down debuffs. Do not get hit by more than one of these blasts or you will die. Soak towers will then appear that must be soaked by players in the order that they were originally attacked by the boss. However, right before they need to move in to soak a tower, each player will first drop a massive circle AoE underneath them. To handle this, players will identify which number in the attack order they are, and then identify which soak tower they are responsible for, based on the order that they spawn in. Once they identify their tower, they can run to a tile close to their tower, making sure not to overlap with any of the other players waiting to be attacked. As soon as their AoE circle is dropped underneath them, they'll move into their tower to soak the damage. The timing of all of these individual attacks make it so that you can drop your AoE circles on other people's towers if necessary, as they will resolve before their tower will. The only thing players must watch out for is to not drop their own circle completely on top of their soak tower. It's easy to psych yourself out here by looking at what other players are doing or where their towers and AoEs are dropping. Focus only on your own movement and you'll be fine. Once the 4th towers are soaked, the boss will cast Ionopeer again. Stack for heals and shields away from the 2 tanks. 2 more auto attacks before another Tyrant's Unholy Darkness double tank buster. There will be another 2 more auto attacks and the boss will cast Natural Alignment again. 2 players from the same role group will again be afflicted by a 48-second Natural Alignment debuff, and they'll need to avoid taking damage during this time. The boss will then cast Inverse Magics and will target either one or both of these players with an extra debuff that will reverse the effect of their incoming cast. The boss will cast Twist Nature, and one of the Natural Alignment players will have the stack spread cast bars appear above their head. The clones will appear on the west edge of the platform again, rendering either the 1st or 2nd row safe. The first stack or spread attack will begin casting here. The players will have the extra step of identifying if the cast is inversed or not. If the player casting has the Inverse Magics debuff, then the slower cast will go off first. If they don't have the extra debuff, what you see is what you'll get. If players need to stack first, they can do so in the middle of the safe row, while the 2 Natural Alignment players move far away from them. If the players need to instead spread, they'll each have a static assigned position relative to the available safe row to spread into. Doing so will ensure there will never be overlap. The first stack or spread will go off with the first round of clone attacks. The next round will be the opposite attack of the first, which will be handled within the new safe row, positioned appropriately to avoid death. A 3rd round of clones will appear here and players will again need to identify the safe row. The next Natural Alignment player will then begin to cast Ice or Fire. This is again baited and handled in the exact same manner as the first Natural Alignment, with the only added caveat of checking to see if the player also has Inverse Magics. If they do, make sure you adjust for the opposite attack of what is displayed on the cast bar. Once these 2 rounds of attacks go off, the boss will cast Ashing Blaze and all players must immediately move to the safe side of the platform to avoid getting hit. Next up, another Ionopeer cast, followed by 2 auto attacks, a double tank buster, and 1 more auto attack before the boss casts another high concept. Again, this cast will deal massive raid-wide damage, and healers will need to be ready to top and shield everyone after that initial damage. This second high concept begins in a similar manner to the first one. The Alpha, Beta, and Gamma players with the short debuffs will immediately run to their assigned corners. However, this time, the yellow 2-stack multi-splice player will also be marked with a long letter debuff. They will stand on the yellow 2-way marker as usual and stack with the player that is also marked with a single long letter debuff. Instead of a 3-stack debuff, one player will instead have a red solo stack debuff. This player will stand on the 3-way marker by themselves. They'll also be afflicted with a long letter debuff. The remaining 2 players will have no debuffs at all. These players will both run and stand with the red alpha player to partake of their gift once they explode. The boss will cast Arcane Control as the first round of debuffs resolve, and 2 elemental puddles will appear in the center. Similar to High Concept 1, the players with matching elements to the puddles will fuse together in the center and communicate which tower they plan on soaking. While they do this, the 2 players who originally had no debuffs and stood in the first red alpha blast will stack together until they fuse, creating 2 fiery Conception Ifrit markers above their heads. The player with a leftover marker can hang out from now. The boss will cast Ashing Blaze, and all players must move into the safe side of the platform as necessary. The first round of tower soaks will go off at the same time. Immediately after, the players with the long debuffs will run to their assigned corners, while all other players move into the southeast corner to avoid getting hit. At this point, there are 4 players with animal concept markers above their heads. The 2 players that soak the first set of towers, and the 2 unmarked players that fuse together to form Ifrit at the beginning. These players will have to take care not to fuse their animals together while they wait in the southeast for the long debuffs to resolve. As soon as the long debuff explosions go off, 4 clones will appear at each cardinal on the edge of the arena, and 4 puddles of 2 elements will appear in the center. The animal concept players will each immediately run to a clone, as these will soon tether to the player closest to them. To avoid confusion, we have the 2 red Ifrit markers always go for the north and east clones, while the original tower soak animals will go for the west and south. Communicate verbally or use body language while you're waiting in the southeast corner to determine who will handle which clone. Once tethered, these players will need to drag their clones clockwise to the outer rows, as they will attack the row that their tethered player is standing on. The tethered players will also need to move 1 tile into their assigned row to avoid getting blasted by an adjacent clone. If all clones are dragged appropriately, their attacks will target the outer tiles of the platform, leaving the 4 center tiles safe for the remaining players to handle soaking the final puddles. After the long debuffs explode and the puddles form, the alpha and beta players will both move to fuse near the 2 north puddles, while the gamma player and the leftover marker player will move to fuse near the 2 south puddles. This specific movement will work every time, regardless of what elemental puddles spawn, As each pair fuses, they'll need to quickly communicate which tower they will soak based on the elements that they're fusing. All 4 players will move into their towers to soak and remain there until the puddles and clone attacks resolve. At this point, the boss will become targetable and you may resume your attacks. The boss will slowly begin to cast Ego Death, a lethal blast. At this time, the players with the red Ifrit concept markers and the players with the green Zoo concept markers will need to immediately pair up and fuse to form an Immortal Spark marker. Once formed, all 4 of these markers will then immediately link up and begin to fuse. This final fusion will bring all player HP to 1 and kill any player that is not at max HP once the fusion completes. Both healers will need to ensure all players are fully healed before this damage goes out to avoid deaths. Once the final fusion explosion goes off, all players will be marked with Immortal Conception Phoenix buffs. This buff must be on each player before the boss completes his Ego Death cast, or you will die. Well, you die anyway, but with the Immortal Conception buff, you will be reborn, allowing you to continue the fight with an insanely beefy damage buff. If you're manually rezzed after this point, you will not come back with a damage buff. The enrage check can be pretty tight here based on your gear, so you'll want everyone rocking the buff going into this phase. The boss will cast Ionagonia, dealing massive raid-wide damage that also applies a short 6-second bleed on all players. You'll need some heavy raid-wide mitigation, shields, and heals. Healers will also need to top everyone off before the next cast goes off. Dominion will target 4 random players, 2 from each role group, with large circle attacks that will place an earth resistance down 2 debuff on any player's hit. At the same time, 4 soak tower telegraphs will appear on the platform, moving from the center of the room towards the north side of the platform in a random orientation. Players that were not initially hit and debuffed by Dominion will each need to chase and soak one of these towers once they settle. If a tower is missed, it will explode and debuff the entire raid. To avoid confusion, we assign a priority system for each player and role so that everyone knows exactly what tower they're soaking based on who is available to soak with them. To further facilitate this priority system, we have the far left and far right players call out their soaking in each round. Once they soak their tower, these players will also be afflicted with an earth resistance down 2 debuff. A second round of towers to soak will appear in the center and begin moving towards the north side of the platform in a random orientation. By this point, the players that were initially hit by Dominion will have their debuffs falling off, and it will be their turn to chase and soak their assigned towers in this round. As the second round of towers resolves, the boss casts another Ionagonia. Again, use heavy raid mitigation, heals, and shields. Top everyone off before the next Dominion cast goes off. Again, 4 players will be targeted by the first attacks, while the other 4 players move in to soak the first round of towers. Once the second round of towers appear, the first group of players will chase and soak them. After the second Dominion, the boss will cast one final Ionagonia blast to heal through. Don't forget your raid mitigation, shields, and heals. Once this final bleed debuff falls off, there will be no more healing requirement and healers can focus on dealing damage. The boss will then begin casting one final Ego Death and Rage. You'll need to destroy him before this cast goes off or you will wipe. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.